I'm battling a bit of a sore throat, so I apologize if I sound a bit off today. Today we'll be looking at this passage from Romans 4:4-8. Now to him that worketh is the reward, not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Even as David also describeth the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth righteousness without works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. We're going to be talking about the idea that if you have faith, true saving faith, then you will have works. I considered framing this as a debunking of Catholicism because a lot of Catholics falsely believe that this is the Catholic doctrine. This isn't surprising. Catholics are often very ignorant of what their own religion teaches because many Catholic apologists like to intentionally obfuscate their own religion. I suspect many Catholics know that there is a disagreement between them and Protestants over faith and works, and they know that the Bible teaches we aren't saved by works, so they assume that the Catholic position must be that we're saved by faith, but faith that will always produce works, while the Protestant position is that we're saved by faith and works have nothing to do with it. In reality, of course, this isn't true. The Catholic position is that we're saved by a combination of faith and works, and that works are separable from faith and another thing upon which our salvation is conditioned. Does this obviously contradict the Bible? Yes, but when has that bothered Catholics? The mainstream Protestant position is the one that says we're saved by faith, but if you have the faith, you'll have the works. So who believes in the idea that we're saved by faith alone, and faith alone means just that, faith alone? There's no attempt to introduce works into it at all? Who believes that? Well, Bible-believing Christians. The only real verse offered against this position is people who refer to James 2:14, where it suggests if somebody says he has faith but doesn't have works, then faith can't save him. Protestants and confused Catholics, for the sake of simplicity, I'll group them together in this video as unalonists, use this to argue that there is a type of faith that does not produce works, and as such a faith that doesn't save. However, as I've pointed out on this channel before, it says if a man says he has faith. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that a man who actually does have faith could be unsaved due to his lack of works. Indeed, we've already seen a passage that explicitly says that he that does not work but believes is saved. Many passages in the Bible stress that salvation is through faith without works. Unalonists will say that this just means that the works aren't necessary for the salvation itself, but the faith that is necessary will be accompanied by works eventually. Of course, nowhere does the Bible say that. I could have started this video with the passage from Matthew 7, where Jesus says, Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? This is talking about people who are not going to heaven. I think a good rule of thumb for Bible-believing Christians might be to look at times in the Bible where the beliefs of unsaved people are evidenced and think, could that possibly be me? And if the answer is yes, maybe that's a sign there's something wrong with your thinking. In this case, we can see that the unsaved people appeal to their works as evidence of their salvation. This is something that I would never do. I would never say to Jesus, but Lord, I did many wonderful works for you. However, if you're an unalonist who thinks that saving faith is always accompanied by good works, then you might appeal to your good works as evidence that you're saved. Whom does that place you in the company of? Also, these people sound quite arrogant, don't they? God himself must let them into heaven because they've proven their faith with all their wonderful works. To me, that sounds like arrogance. It sounds like humans arguing they deserve to go to heaven. But aren't they saying the exact same thing as unalonists are saying? I have faith and I have the works to prove I'm saved. The Bible makes it clear that Christians are not to boast in Romans 3:27 and elsewhere, and it also makes it clear Christians can know they're saved in 1 John 5:13. However, if you're an unalonist who believes that your works prove that you have saving faith, how is that not boasting? You're saying your own works prove that you must be saved, so much so that you can know it. I know that I'm saved because I know my salvation is 100% about Christ's work and 0% about mine. And I trust Christ's work. I trust that he lived a sinless life, that he died on the cross for me, and that he, as God, produced an account of this. The only way to make assurance of salvation work with a refusal to boast is to base that assurance not at all in your own works. There's an interesting illustration by Francis Chan, which first made me realize the problem with the unalonist belief. I'm not saying Francis Chan is necessarily saved, he has some beliefs that bother me, but I think this is a good illustration. He lays out a continuum of good and evil, and to elaborate on the spectrum, he places certain people along it. And then he asks, where should the dividing line be between heaven and hell? And this is when we realize the problem with work salvation. It's ridiculous to say that there is some arbitrary point along this spectrum where you suddenly become good enough to enter heaven, or suddenly become evil enough to go to hell. This is one reason why it intuitively makes more sense that God, as the perfect judge, doesn't operate that way. He doesn't place the sign at some arbitrary place along that continuum. Now, some groups like the Muslims will say it's more like a raffle, where being good earns you more chances of getting into heaven, but there's no definitive cutoff point. This degree of randomness at least functions to blur the edges of this tipping point between heaven and hell, and as such makes it feel a little less arbitrary. It's not as if there's some level of goodness that takes you from guaranteed hell to guaranteed heaven. However, in another sense, it's obviously a lot more arbitrary. I think this illustration demonstrates how stupid it is for human beings to act as if there is such a thing as being good enough in God's kingdom, as if there's a point where God will say, sure, you've done some sins, but you're good enough to have earned your way into heaven. God fundamentally does not work like that. He's on a level so far above ours in righteousness that to suggest that giving a little bit extra to charity or lying a little bit less will tilt God one way or the other in terms of our eternal destination is nonsense. The big issue is this idea that there's some sins that aren't really that bad, which is of course what everybody is saying who believes in work salvation. Somebody who murders and cheats, that's bad. That's a bad sin. That's a seriously salvation jeopardizing sin. However, me lying or lusting or being covetous, the things I do, they're not bad sins, not really bad sins. Sure, I'm not perfect, but I'm good enough. A murderer isn't good enough, but I am. That's not how God thinks of things. What you should hopefully notice, though, is that an unalonist finds themselves in basically the exact same situation, just with slightly different wording. For them, it's not good enough to earn your way to heaven, but it's good enough to prove you have saving faith. But the logic remains the same. Every so-called Christian who has ever responded to the question, so a Christian can just murder somebody and still go to heaven? With the response, well, a true Christian with true saving faith wouldn't commit murder, is doing the exact same thing a work salvationist would do. They're saying, well, murder is a bad sin. That's a really bad sin. That's the type of sin a saved person wouldn't do. My sins? They're not really bad sins. Yes, I feel bad about them, and I apologize for them at church on Sunday, but I still have faith that saves. After all, my faith is accompanied with so many good works, and not many bad works, not really bad works. If you recognize that we are actually saved by faith alone, entirely apart from works, you realize that while obviously some sins are worse than others, and some people are worse than others, there is no dividing line between good enough and really bad. There's no point where you can say you've done enough to prove you have saving faith, just like there's no point where you can say you've done enough to earn salvation. Obviously try to be the best person you can, but don't think that this in any way relates to your salvation. Considering that unalonism is basically just work salvation with extra steps, as I just demonstrated, it's unsurprising that a lot of the time unalonists are pretty insincere people. They'll claim that they absolutely do believe that it is that faith saves us, and doing good works isn't what saves us at all, it's only evidence that we are saved. But a lot of the time, they don't behave consistently with that. I remember early on in becoming a Christian, I saw a post on the Christianity subreddit where somebody had said they got saved, and the top comment was from a Lutheran, and it said, okay, but make sure you have good works, because that's how we know we're saved. That's work salvation. That's not make sure you have sincere faith and then works will come after that. Honestly, if faith that saves genuinely is never alone, you shouldn't need to mention works at all then, because the work should come naturally. The irony is that preaching about the importance of good works makes more sense if you're actually faith alone, because then you recognize somebody might have faith and not have good works, so they'll need to hear about the importance of good works. For the people who believe faith automatically produces good works, why even preach about good works? Just preach about faith and the works will come automatically, unless you're saying people need to hear about the works so they can do the works and ensure their faith is true. But then, that's work salvation. The ignorant Catholics who think that their religion is the one that teaches faith that saves is never alone are obviously misinformed, but they're not necessarily that wrong. After all, faith that saves is never alone is not that far from what they actually teach, which is that works must be attained independently to cooperate with faith. In reality, that's what a lot of Protestants believe too. This is why I tend to say that I'm not a Protestant. Protestants are only a stone's throw away from Catholicism on lots of points. I'm a Christian. I believe in actual faith alone, not faith plus works as proof that the faith is actually the right kind of faith.